College of the Arts at Kennesaw, I think, is one of the most exciting and vibrant artistic communities here in Georgia.
We've built a really sterling reputation in all of our arts disciplines here.
KSU has a unique ecosystem of artistic disciplines all in one college.
The ability for students to not be afraid to express their ideas, to share their questions, to celebrate their research is a valuable opportunity for them.
Our faculty are dynamic artists, teachers, researchers.
The value of undergraduate research is exploring real depth to find deeper and deeper answers.
So it's very exciting to see young people coming in and they want to come to KSU because of certain professors or because of certain programming.
Almost every semester I've been in a show. So there's never not an opportunity for you to do what you love and to shine doing it.
So the opportunities that you get here to further yourself as a musician are pretty crazy.
And being able to do all these different things, I think has made me such a great artist and just an overall better person.
I think now I'm an artist more than anything.
We are committed to a holistic approach in the arts, developing our students both as scholars and as artists.
What are you waiting for? Come in. It's beautiful here.
Hello, my name is Craig Brasco. I'm an associate professor of art at the School of Art and Design at Kennesaw State University. And today what I'd like to do is present a brief video on how to use Photoshop to make your own brushes. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what you should see here is a blank canvas in Photoshop. I'm using a white background, and also the dimension of the canvas is 11 by 17. So it's actually 17 inches wide, 11 inches tall. That's a good size for making a good sketchbook and just drawing and doodling in Photoshop. So primarily when you draw and paint in Photoshop, there's a particular tool that is used more than any other. So I'm going to pull down a window called Tools, and this is the toolbar in Photoshop. I'm going to pull down another window called Layers, just so we can have that available. And between these two windows, we can experiment with making brushes. So there's another pair of windows that we need to access just so that we can learn about what brushes are and how we can use them. So under Window, select Brushes, and also Brush Settings. So these are the two main windows that we need. I actually have my own set of brushes that I've created along with a collection of other artist brushes. Those you can install, and that might be the subject of another video. Primarily what I wanted to talk about today, though, was using brushes that are already included with Photoshop and then making your own brushes from that. So included with the brushes in Photoshop are a folder called General Brushes, and inside of that you'll find wet media brushes, dry media brushes, and then a small collection of default brushes that aren't in a folder, and then another set called special effect brushes. So the ones that are in the folders are actually made by an artist named Kyle, and he is still famous for being incredibly good at what I'm demonstrating in this video. He was so good, in fact, that he was able to make a sale/deal with Adobe, and they have included all of his brushes in Photoshop. I think this is as of 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So These are great brushes for drawing, and I do recommend these if you have never drawn or painted before. These are made by an artist for drawing and painting, and they're excellent. However, if you're curious about making your own brush, this video will help you. What I recommend is that you start with this brush. It's called the hard round brush. And the tool, of course, to use with this is the brush tool. That's located here. And it looks like a brush. Adobe recently has added these cool little videos that kind of demonstrate what a tool does before you use them. The key for this tool is the B key. So whenever you want, you can hit B and get the brush tool. So there's just a couple of things I want to demonstrate before we get into this. There's a preference that I prefer when using the brush tool. If you are on a Mac, you can go to Photoshop and select Preferences, and then go to Cursors. What I prefer is to use a normal brush tip and show crosshair and brush tip. So what that means is when you see the brush, you can see a small little crosshair in the middle. That's just a personal preference. So mainly, I would recommend that you actually show the brush shape. That's this circle that you see here. So whenever you create a brush, it actually has a shape that appears on the screen and allows you to paint. So I'm just kind of messing around here and making some marks on the page. Now I'm doing this using a Wacom tablet. When you draw and paint in Photoshop on a computer, that is desirable to have a Wacom device or a similar product. You can also use a Cintiq, which is a touch screen. And actually there's a way to use an iPad if you have one, with an iPad pencil or an Apple Pencil to do the same thing. There's a software that's called AstroPad that allows you to use your iPad similarly as a tablet. So it's somewhat pricey, but considering the fact that you get to use your iPad as a drawing tool on your computer, that's actually not a bad deal. So naturally, there are other kinds of tablet technology out there you can use, but primarily I use Wacom. So let's see, I'm going to use the keyboard feature Command Delete to clear my canvas, and actually all that does is fill the canvas with the background color, which in this case is white. And I'm going to talk about how some basic controls and how we can use these basic brushes to build something new. So just so you know, the bracket keys that are located next to the P key, they look like this. They're square brackets. So the left side key makes your brush smaller, and the right side key makes your brush bigger. So you don't have to use any slider bars or anything like that. I can just hit the keys and these changes take place. So this is a bigger brush and this is a smaller brush. Another thing to know is you can use your number keypad, 1, 2, 3, etc., to change the opacity of your brush. So for instance, if I press 5, my brush paints at 50% opacity, so it's somewhat see-through. If I press 7, that's 70%, 0 is 100%, etc., 3, 30%, and so on. So when you're making a brush, this can actually be pretty handy. Just those two basic controls I think are really good to know, so you're not constantly having to use another window to adjust your brush. So with that said, I'm going to clear my canvas again and make sure my brush is set to 100%. Okay, so when you're making a brush in Photoshop, really the purpose of this is to have some experience with traditional media, actually. So what we're actually doing when you're creating a brush is you're creating what I like to think of as a footprint. In other words, if I'm using a brush or a pencil, a crayon, a Conte crayon, chalk, what have you, this is a mark that gets made in general with this implement or this tool. So what I want to do is create something that, you know, emulates that to some degree and just have fun and experiment with it. So the footprint of this brush currently is literally just a black circle like that. And it doesn't have any really profound settings or anything. And based on this window, it actually has one that's called smoothing. That's it. So there's so much more we could do with this. Not to mention there's a way to capture a footprint that you design. So that's what we're going to do today. Let's see. First, what I think I'll do is I'm going to make my brush smaller. And what I'm going to do is just kind of randomly create this shape. What I'm thinking about when I'm drawing this is kind of like maybe an acrylic brush, perhaps. And what I think I'll also do is use this brush to make some little pits and things like that inside the shape. And if I want, I can also do some opacity change. So I could use like a light gray or something on the outside of this to give it some not so opaque edges. And also what I'm doing is pressing the Option key to select the eyedrop tool. And what that allows me to do is grab the white of the canvas so that I'm kind of like erasing, if you will. And I can also do that to select black again to be able to paint the positive space of this brush shape. So yeah, this is basically like painting with positive and negative to find a cool shape for your brush. This looks kind of like an alien or something. Maybe that's what I'll call it. All right. So there you go. That's my shape. So let's try that out and see what happens. So what you need at this point is another tool, actually. So I'm going to pull my toolbar back out. The tool that I need is called the marquee tool. I could use a lasso tool, I guess, but really the marquee is best. So there's different kinds of marquees. There's an elliptical one and a rectangular one. And there's also polygonal ones, depending on what tool you're using. But what this allows me to do is draw what's called a selection. So what a selection is this field of dancing lines, you might call it. They used to be called marching ants, actually. I don't think I've heard that term in a while, but that's what this indicates, is that this space is being isolated. So right now, according to this selection, only what's inside of this rectangle is being considered. So what that means is now is I can use a special edit feature to capture what I've drawn. And that's located here under the Edit menu tab. If I go down about halfway or so, there is an option called Define Brush Preset. So I'm going to select that, and you'll see that what happens is my drawing is now captured in this little icon window along with its general size, and it's asking me to give it a name. So I'm going to call this Alien because that's what it looks like. But I'm also going to say, let's say, aqueous brush, because I don't know if it's exclusively like an acrylic brush. So I'm just going to say aqueous brush and hit OK. Now what happens is you can see two things. First, the selection is still there and my footprint is still there. But now if you look at my brush shape, you can see it's no longer round like before. It actually looks like an outline of what I just created. So what I need to do now is deselect, which is Command D or Control D on a PC. And what that does is it eliminates that selection. That's important because if I don't do that, then I can't experiment with my brush. So now I can kind of drag my brush around and see what it's doing. That's kind of cool. Actually, though, it's more like an image hose at this point. In other words, it's just taking that shape and repeating it over and over again every time I make a brush stroke. Now, that's kind of interesting, right? But it's not exactly what I'm after. So just for clarity, if you look here in the brushes window now, this guy is now captured as a brush, a general brush. But also what I need to do is look here in this window, which is the brush settings. So this is a little different. The first thing you'll see is a column of selections over on the left side. So the very first one you'll see is called brush tip shape. And what that does is allows you to see the actual brush itself and make some adjustments. This is actually recorded here as an icon with all the other brushes that you may have. Like I have a big collection here of various brushes. Now, if you scroll up and down, eventually you'll see where your brush is. And there it is right there that I just created. So what can you do? Well, you can do things like this. You can say flip X and Y. And what that does is you can actually have your brush shape change direction like this, like have it flip up and down instead of the way you have it designed. Another thing you can do is alter the hardness and roundness of your brush like so I can kind of squish them if I want to. You can change the angle of the brush like so. And those are just some general changes you can make. Another one is spacing. So this one's kind of interesting. So what happens is you can make this so that they space apart every time you paint. So this is actually kind of, could be really interesting. I could make a grass texture or something like that with this, right? So that's kind of neat. So those are just some general things you can do to the brush shape, but actually I think what I'm going to do is leave it as it is and not change it too much because there's other features I'd like to try first. All right, so I'm going to clear my canvas here again with my new captured brush, and I'm going to go through some of these settings and show you how they work. Let's see. And primarily I'm going to touch on the ones that I think are most relevant for just creating a brush on its own. And then I'll point out the ones that I don't think really help with that so much so that you can experiment with those on your own. So the first one is shape dynamics. Now, this has 3 particular controls: size, angle, and roundness. The word that comes after that actually is really cool because what Photoshop does is it has the ability to jitter or create randomness based on controls from your tablet. In particular, one of those controls is called pen pressure, which is probably the best one to use. So what that means is depending on how hard I press down on the tablet, the brush will change its shape. So right away, like having that is a huge difference from this, right? So that's without that control. And what you see here is with that control, with that size jitter applied. So if you want it to be extremely random, you can set it all the way to 100%. And what you'll get is like some really crazy, variation of size, depending on just even the slightest touch on the screen or on your tablet. So I'm actually going to say for this one 50% and of course set it to pen pressure. Now you can have a minimum diameter set up, which means that no matter how much jitter there is, there's always this minimum amount of size. I'm going to leave that alone. Angle jitter, this makes the brush rotate as you paint. So this is really interesting now. So instead of, even though I have the thick to thin, what's happening is this alien brush shape is kind of rotating as I paint. I rather like that. That's kind of nice. So I'm going to keep that. I can also make that apply to pen pressure, like this. Now right away I can start mixing this up with some opacity changes, and you can see like this is really creating a cool type texture. Roundness jitter, this like forces the brush to be more confined to a like primitive shape, like a circle or square or something like that. So this is basically rectangular. So I think what this is doing is forcing the brush to stay more in a rectangular shape. I don't really care for that. So I think I'm gonna maybe play around with this, but yeah, I might allow a little bit of this, not a whole lot, like 25%. And then keep that. So there's other things you can do with this. You can force the brush to flip on its y-axis, which is up and down. You can force it to flip on its x-axis, which is left to right, and create these other like slight anomalies with your brush. Okay, let's see. Scattering is the next one. This, I think, just depends on the brush you want to do, but in general, what scattering does is it makes the brush literally scatter itself as you paint. Now, if I was using this for, like, say, a texture to create brush or grass or something, this might be really handy. It's kind of having that feel right now, honestly, so I think I might actually consider that, but for now, I'm going to just turn that off. You can actually control the amount of scattering and the jitter or randomness of that based on pressure as well. So like I said, though, I think I'm just going to leave this off for now. And turn that down. Okay, great. Texture, this allows you to actually import an image to use as texture with your brush. I don't use this very often, and I think I would actually have to do an entire like process like this to determine a texture to use to apply to a brush. It's not really something I would do randomly, but essentially what you can do is use a pre-formatted texture if you wanted to experiment, or import your own, like I mentioned, and then apply that to the brush. So if you wanted this to have more of a chalky texture, you could maybe find something that was kind of grainy looking and then apply that. Dual brush, this is really interesting. So what this does is allows you to start with one brush shape and then end with another. So it basically merges two brush types together. It's very interesting to play around with, and in fact can have a nice effect on maybe taming a brush if it gets a little bit too crazy. This is fun to play around with, but again, it requires that you actually have a lot of selections to choose from, which you probably don't if you haven't done this before. So that's, I think I'll leave that one off. Color dynamics, this allows you to actually use this toolbar here to use the foreground and background colors to set your brush to combine between these two values. So essentially I could say, you know, paint with this red color, but then if I don't press down very hard, it becomes this orange color instead. So, or yellowish color. So this is a way you could kind of mix colors together. I don't normally use this for painting, but it's definitely fun to experiment with. So I'll let you try that out. But this brush, I really want it to be more just like a rendering brush. So let me fix this real quick. All right, transfer. This is a big one. Use this all the time. So I set the control to pen pressure, and what this does is it makes your brush faint and very transparent until you press down with some pressure, and then it becomes more opaque. So this is a must-have, I think, for most brushes. So it actually makes the opacity control I mentioned earlier built into your brush, which is, I think, advisable. That's the way to do it. So I'm setting my opacity jitter to about 20%, and I don't have a minimum set, and of course I'm using pen pressure. Now flow, this is an interesting one because flow is actually meant more for airbrush type brushes, and this one is not meant to be an airbrush. So I'm gonna just leave that for now, set to 0. I want this to be like an actual aqueous media brush, like a again, like a brush for acrylics or gouache or something like that. Brush pose, this is a tricky one. What this is supposed to do is override or force your brush to ignore or exaggerate how you tilt your stylus when you paint. Now, personally, I don't really tilt my stylus at all when I paint. I usually hold it the same way, just like I would traditionally. I might change the angle of my hand slightly, but the way I actually grasp the brush doesn't change. So I don't really use brush pose. I don't really see a purpose for it. But you're happy to experiment with it to see if you're a person that likes to rotate their hand or their implement while they draw. This is definitely something that could work for you. All right, so these last few that I have to show you are special because they're just basically on and off switches. So noise, what that does is it includes a level of texture, not unlike what you're doing with the actual texture feature, but it just gives some granularity to your brush. Wet edges, what this does is simulates watercolors. So what happens is the edge of the brush gets darker as you paint, and the interior actually looks a little washed out because that's where the majority of the water is collected. And of course, it does tend to bleed together, and it creates kind of this, again, like an aqueous feel. So this is actually not a bad thing to have for this particular brush if I'm going to use it in that fashion. Buildup, this is where you're basically allowing the brush to compound over time. Now there's brush modes we can use for this as well, and maybe I'll touch on that in a different video. But essentially what this does is it creates an opaque intensity over time and allows the brush to develop. So this actually is a nice feature to have for this particular brush because it's so textury. It's got a lot of edges to it. Smoothing, this is a default setting that I pretty much use for every brush. Again, this is just to kind of, when you make a mark, it makes it more smooth and consistent. There's this thing called brush cycles when you're using digital painting. And what that is essentially every time you make a series or a mark, it's actually a collection of brushes in sequence. So when we were doing that spacing feature here, this is actually happening all the time when you make a brush shape or when you're using a brush. So when spacing is normal like this and you have smoothing activated, what that's actually doing is making sure that that brush shape stays as smooth looking as possible when you're making marks. And then finally, protect texture. So if you're using noise and you're using texture, this will try to preserve that texture feel as much as possible versus like if you're doing a buildup or something, that texture might go away. So this is to support that and keep it around. I don't use that very much, honestly, and I'm actually considering that the wet edges thing is maybe not the best for this brush either. Okay, so I only have a minute or so left. So what I'd like to share lastly is when you've created a brush, you have to save it. If you don't save it, all this work you've done goes away. So whenever you're finished, go to the sidebar menu in the brush settings and say new brush preset. And you can say capture brush size and preset. Sure. Include the tool settings, yes. And I tend not to include color because that can actually be a pain. And then just change the name if you want and hit OK. And now if you look in your brush window, you'll see that you've just created a brand new brush. And you can use this for your own artwork. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this video. And hopefully in future videos, I can do similar tutorials like this, and I appreciate you watching. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.